Scott Janish and Simon Carlsen join me this week to discuss non-alcoholic beer and new yeast strains. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 276. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 276, and it's late February 2023. Scott Janish and Simon Carlsen join me this week to discuss non-alcoholic beer and new yeast strains. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Every issue of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine is packed with articles for homebrewers and beer lovers. They offer access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and the amazing Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com to get your subscription today. I also want you to check out the web-based version of BeerSmith, which is now available at beersmithrecipes.com. BeerSmith for the web lets you build, edit, and brew recipes from any browser, including your desktop, tablet, or mobile device. You can try BeerSmith Web for 30 days by setting up an account at beersmithrecipes.com. If you purchase a Gold, Platinum, or Pro license, you get both BeerSmith Web and the desktop version for one low price. Check out beersmithrecipes.com today to give it a try. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, I welcome back Scott Janish. Scott is the author of the book, The New IPA, A Scientific Guide to Hop Aroma and Flavor. He's also co-founder of Sapwood Cellars Brewery in Maryland, and with his partner, Michael Tonsmeyer, who we had on last show. I also welcome Simon Carlsen, Principal Application Specialist from CHR Hansen in Denmark. Simon's been working the last 4 years primarily on specialty yeast strains and their application for the production of non-alcoholic beer and AFB. It's great to have you guys both on the show. Scott, let's get you on first. How you doing, Scott?
Doing good. It's great to be back on here.
A pleasure to have you. I think it was about a year ago I had you on last. And of course, Simon, welcome for the first time. Great to have you from Denmark, actually.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me.
A pleasure. Well, Scott, I had Michael Tonsmeyer on the last episode. And he's, of course, is your partner at Sapwood Cellars. You've been working on some of the non-alcoholic beers there, I guess.
Yeah, it's been kind of a fun, I still keep the experimentation going here. We have little spike fermenter that we use for, small batch trials. And so, really trying to make a hop forward non-alcoholic beer. Well, I guess it's really like 0.5%. So there's a little bit of alcohol in there, but it can be a challenge, and it's been fun to experiment with it.
And I didn't even know you guys were doing a lot of non-alcoholic beers. Is that something that you started recently?
It's really just something we'll do in really small batch stuff and put it on draft. So we're not, packaging anything that's going out the door. It's just, like I said, it's like 15-gallon batches for the most part, and just goes on tap and a nice non-alcoholic or a low alcohol option for people. And they go pretty quick too, actually, surprisingly.
And we've been going back and forth for months now. I guess you've been working with a bunch of new yeast strains, right?
Yeah, so I've been working with Simon. So we did we tasted a whole bunch of NA beers kind of over a video, and then I've recently was just in New Zealand, and I was at the Garage Project, and they have a really good non-alcohol program with what they're doing there, and I believe they're canning a lot of it. So I picked their brain quite a bit to try to figure out a process and procedures, and Simon sent some yeast that I could play with that he could speak more about, but it's a wild yeast strain that was found on, I believe it was Sauvignon Blanc grapes in New Zealand, and it's one that Pichia Claveri is the name, and they have a couple different yeast strains that Simon can talk about. But essentially, it only ferments glucose, and so what you're doing is you're ending up with a beer that drops just a little bit during fermentation to get you about 0.5% or so. And they're fun strains, and they're quite a bit in research that they've been used mostly for the wine world. But they work pretty good in these NA beers too. There's some research that says that the they're fairly high glycerol production yeast, which helps for NA beers because there's just not a lot there. So anything that helps mouthfeel would be a good thing. And they after about 36, 48 hours, I found it helps hide some of the wort-like flavors that you often get in these beers. And they could be a little fruity too. So there's I get like kind of a pear or peach kind of ester from it on its own. So we could talk more about a process and all that, but that's kind of the
very
basics.
cool. Yeah. Well, Simon, I wanted to welcome you, first-time guest. You work at CHR Hansen in Denmark. Can you tell us a little bit about the company and what it specializes in?
Sure. So we are quite old company, actually. We are 149 years old now. So
wow.
150 years next. So we are primarily working in the dairy industry. We started out making rennet for cheese making and natural colors for coloring cheese and butter. And then we grew from there, and now we are a global company, about 3,500 employees, and primarily working with the dairy sector, but also in human and animal health. We have a wine and fermented beverages department where I'm sitting. And beer and non-alcohol beer is something we've been doing for the last 6 years or so. And I have to say, I really enjoy working with people like Scott on these projects and seeing what we can do with our yeast strains, and especially the non-alcoholic and alcohol-free beer is something I've worked closely with and is very, very dear to me.
Well, it's interesting to me. So how did you guys go from the dairy industry into non-alcoholic beer?
So we have been in wine for a long time, and a lot of the stuff we do in dairy is actually bacteria for cheese making and fresh dairy. And there, of course, we have one of the largest culture collection of bacteria. And from there on, we started moving into wine first with the Enococcus for malolactic fermentation. And then we started with the pre-fermentative yeast, which is non-Saccharomyces yeast that you use prior to the alcoholic fermentation in winemaking. And as Scott just said, the Pichia cloveri is something that came out of that program. So we had Pichia cloveri on the market for the wine. And then we realized that this species was actually very interesting, and we could also use it to make some very nice non-alcoholic beers with.
Interesting. Well, Scott, can you walk us through the process you use to make NA beer? Because I know there's like 4 or 5 different methods. Some people use a vacuum distillation system, but what are you doing?
Yeah, that's why I like this process, because it's something home brewers can try, or you can just try without expensive equipment to dealkalize something, but it is a unique fermentation in that it's really quick. So I mean, these are beers that I think that are pretty much done in about 48 hours. But it's unique in that if you think about a normal fermentation, there's so much CO2 being created that if you have a fermentation vessel that you can see through, it kind of looks like a lava lamp. It's just so active, everything's going. But since there's not a lot of CO2 being produced in these fermentations, the yeast would just kind of flock out and kind of drop to the bottom. So you have to keep it agitated. So what we do, and this is advice from Simon, is we hook it up to, I sanitize a pump, and the entire time it's fermenting, I'm basically coming out of the bottom of the tank and going back in through the top. Just to keep the beer moving.
So you're doing a recirculation, I guess, is that right?
Yep. So the recirculation's I don't go super fast, but it's just a nice flow just to keep everything in suspension. And it generally takes 36, 48 hours, and you're seeing a very, very small gravity drop. So
that's what I was wondering. So are you just starting with a really low gravity wort to start with?
Yep, essentially 4 to 6 Plato, something in that range. And then you'll see, a very small drop that gets you about 0.5% if you're doing it in this way.
So I think this is almost like a kombucha or something like that in terms of just really low alcohol fermentation, right?
Yeah, it really is. And I think the other perimeter you can look at is the pH drop to make sure you're getting a good fermentation. That's, for me, it's usually starting around 5 pH and drops to 4.4, 4.5, somewhere in there. And then you can kind of treat it as, you know, it's because there's fermentables in there. This is something that you know, for us, we just keep cold and try to consume right away. But, you know, this is something you might want to consider pasteurizing if you're going to, you know, putting it in a can or a vessel to just ensure that nothing starts to ferment.
So you could pasteurize. Could you use sulfate sorbates as well? Maybe, I don't know.
You could, but the pH
sulfites, I should
these
say.
beers is pretty high, and so that works better at lower pHs.
Yeah.
So you'd have to use quite a bit in a beer that's, especially if you're dry hopping these, your pH is going to get even higher. So you could probably consider like some sort of like heat bath or something like that. But if you're just brewing these at home, just keeping it cold and on tap is probably the way to go.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, what's the taste of the beer? Does it taste like real beer? Is it taste very different like some of the non-alcoholic beers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it tastes like beer. It's definitely going to be. I get like fruity esters from it, which I like, and you know, it is. You know, how we've been doing it is basically taking wort from like a pale ale batch, and I'll just go into a fermenter and then water it down to get to the gravity I'm looking for. So, you know, if you consider it's just like watered down wort, it's pretty interesting how, you know, fruity that it actually can become. But there is, you know, other challenges we could talk about later about getting, you know, hop flavor in there and things like that. But overall, it's a fun, unique beer. And I think it's, you know, a lot of people appreciate the fact that it's, you know, low alcohol, which, you know, high flavor beers and low alcohol is tough to do. But
yeah, you said I think you said 0.5% or less, right?
Yep, exactly. And so there's just not a lot going on in that style of beer. That's why I think you could even, you know, I'm always talking about hoppy beers, but I think in some ways, you know, malt forward beers would be pretty good for this kind of lineup, just to get something that's, you know, higher roast malt or Vienna or things like that can really shine and sort of, you know, not necessarily mass 40 flavors, but in a way it would sort of produce more of a beer-like experience.
What styles have you made so far?
I've only done hoppy ones, which is
IPA styles basically,
yeah. So like a 0.5% IPA is basically what I've been trying.
Interesting. Well, Simon, you've been working with this yeast for some time. Are you primarily working with one yeast strain? And can you talk us through what the yeast strain is and what some of its unique characteristics are?
Yeah, sure. So as Scott said, it's a Pico Clavaris strain. The one he got to test is some of our newer strain that we are just about to release. And we had original strain was called Near, and now we are about to release two new strains called Near 2.0, and one is then subnamed Poly, and the other one is Punch. And the one is the Poly is more neutral flavor, but still aromatic for yeast. And Punch is very flavorful and fruity, and that's the one Scott has been trying. And I think the key feature is really the nice aroma profile that you get. It's super high esters, and of course it helps mask some of the aldehydes that give the woody character and flavor to a non-alcoholic beer. But besides that, we have also shown that it's actually really good at reducing these aldehydes. So it's not only masking, it's actually also converting some of these. So you really lose this feel that it's an unfermented wort that you can have in some non-alcoholic beers. Finally, I think the last thing, and I think Scott also touched that a little bit, is that it produces a lot of body to the beer. So even though you only have 6 Plato or even 5 Plato, you still have a very good mouthfeel in the beer without it necessarily becoming thin or watery. And for me, those are the key features. So far, Scott has been doing 0.5, and that's because the yeast is maltose negative, meaning it only uses the monosaccharides, which maybe comprises 10% of the total sugars.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. How does it work exactly? It doesn't actually ferment the maltose out?
No, it doesn't touch any disaccharides. So it wouldn't touch sucrose either. So it leaves all disaccharide and higher sugars, meaning that there's not a lot of fermentables, but it can make all those nice esters from very little carbon or sugars in this case. And that's really one of the neat things about this yeast. Of course, that also is also increasing the risk of spoilage, because any brewer's yeast that gets in that product will have a really good time due to all the residual maltose, and that's why we normally recommend that you pasteurize it. We have brewers that get away with flash pasteurizing, but in general we recommend the tunnel. And also we have a single brewery that has been able to do, to my knowledge, sterile filtering and then packaging it without getting contaminated beer.
Interesting.
Or else, as Scott said, drink it fast and keep it cold.
So you got which one was he? He was using I can't remember the name of it, but so there's 3 different strains you're working with now, primarily.
Yes, he was using the near punch.
And you've had good results, I guess, because you've been working with other breweries as well.
Yeah, we have been working a lot in Europe, but we're also starting to see some traction in the US. It's quite fun, actually, because it seems that these are one of the things that brewers are very secretive about how to make their non-alcoholic beers.
Yeah, I noticed that.
And it seems like it's almost the next frontier where the brewers are starting to really compete. And what I've heard is also that it should be one of the fastest growing markets or segments within brewing is the non-alcoholic. And I think that talks a little bit to the thing that, these brewers don't share how they're doing. These things where normally they will be very open to share, tips and tricks. They don't tend to do this on non-alcoholic.
Yeah, I've seen that too. I've had some guests on that were kind of quiet about exactly how they're producing their non-alcoholic beers.
Yeah, and I think that the last feature I want to highlight about this yeast is that It's also what is called Crabtree negative, meaning it will not ferment if you give it oxygen. So we've been able to dose very low levels of oxygen into the fermentation tank throughout the process, and thereby the yeast will respire, so it won't produce any alcohol at all. And we have thereby been able to make alcohol-free beer as well, so meaning below 0.05%.
So explain that to me again. So you said Crabtree negative is it won't ferment with oxygen. You don't introduce any oxygen to the beginning of the fermentation, I guess?
No. So actually we do introduce oxygen in the beginning of the fermentation.
Okay, so aiding the sterols and everything.
Quite a lot. And then we let the yeast deplete more or less until we reach 1 ppm of oxygen, and then we keep dosing in a bit of oxygen as the process goes. So there's always a little bit of residual oxygen in the beer until the end of the fermentation. And it's, of course, not a fermentation per se, but until the process is done.
Yeah.
And that prevents the yeast from making alcohol. So, for example, your regular brewer's yeast, Saccharomyces, is called Crabtree positive.
Sure.
I mean, even though there's oxygen present, it will ferment if the sugar concentration is above 0.1 gram per liter. Of course, a little bit depending on strains, but in that level. Pikia does not do that. So as long as there's oxygen, it will not form any alcohol.
Interesting. Very interesting. So are you introducing oxygen throughout the fermentation process then?
Yeah. So we have actually designed a small system based on a dissolved oxygen sensor that can measure and then automatically dose in tiny pulses of oxygen to keep the oxygen level above a certain threshold. But because it's only for the process is very fast, as Scott said, it's 2 to 5 days without oxygen. But since the oxygen really induces exponential growth, things just speed up incredibly. So the process from start to end is normally 24 hours. And then, of course, with a bit of cooling, we're looking at the residence time of the tank, about 48 hours max. So it's not actually a long time there's oxygen, but it's enough to prevent alcohol formation, and we don't see any defects due to oxidation.
I mean, as brewers, we typically are trying to keep oxygen out of the beer, obviously, especially the finished beer. So, I mean, are there any concerns about long-term stability or packaging because of residual oxygen in the beer, or no?
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive to do it, and it's been one of the things that we have been trying to convince brewers that it's actually not bad to do, and it's because all they have learned is always based on Saccharomyces, right? And this is a different species, and the storage stability we have seen so far of these beer has actually been excellent, I would say. Maybe as an example, I have a colleague in Brazil that runs sales in Brazil, and he's an old brewmaster by training, so he did his own study, and he starts saving these beer and keeping them for a long time, and they actually age quite well. Another example would be a Drink Tech. Last year in Germany, we served some non-alcoholic beer, alcohol-free beer made this way that has expired, meaning more than 1 year old, and people wouldn't notice, so they were actually quite surprised when you told them that it had a year shelf life before they drank it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the only experience I have is with meads or wines, high gravity meads or high gravity wines, and both of those you introduce oxygen quite often. Typically, you take a drill and stir the whole thing up. I don't know if that's the same kind of process going on, but it's kind of interesting. So
yeah, but mead and wine would be again Saccharomyces, so you wouldn't prevent. You would probably induce the yeast health, but you wouldn't prevent alcohol formation due to the Crabtree effect.
Yeah, no, I understand that. Okay. Well, Scott, I think you've also started some new frozen liquid yeast, which is a new product format. Can you tell us about your experience with frozen yeast and how it differs from working with traditional yeast?
Yeah, I think it's kind of unique in that you can have it on hand for quite a while, but you have to be able to keep it extremely cold. And so what we've been doing is if it's a frozen strain, it gets obviously it's frozen when it gets shipped, so you just have to have your plan in place and essentially brew it.
So we're talking about liquid yeast that has typically might have a 6-month shelf life. Here you're extending it quite a bit by freezing it at you said very low temperatures though.
Yeah, I think Simon could tell you the temperature you're supposed to keep it at, but I think it's like an 18-month shelf life, right?
Simon?
Yeah, so that's correct. So we have 18-month shelf life in this product, but it has to be stored colder than minus 50 degrees Celsius.
So pretty chilly.
Yes, and we of course are very lucky that we are a global company selling into the dairy industry where a lot of things are shipped on dry ice, meaning we have the infrastructure and the backbone to ship things on dry ice worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
The neat thing, as Scott said, is really you can keep it in your minus 50 freezer, and you can take it out and you just defrost it. It takes about an hour for the big pouches and half an hour for the small pouches, and you can pitch it directly to the tank. And one of the tricks, as I said, by making these non-alcoholic beers, you don't need to ferment a lot, so you don't need that many cells, and they will also grow a lot when you give them oxygen. So the pitch rate is quite low, meaning one bag, the small bag we have has about 110 mil. That's enough for 50 hectoliters.
Wow.
And the big bag that has a liter, that's enough for 500 hectoliters of
so
wort.
that's a tiny fraction of what you might pitch a traditional yeast, right?
Exactly, but that also means that you really don't need to have a propagation, and these yeasts are very difficult to propagate because you normally propagate it on a wort which is maltose dominated, right? But they don't consume maltose,
right?
And when you also propagate, there's also a risk of contamination, which is one of the things that is always an issue with these yeast, that you don't want them to get contaminated, because whatever brewer's yeast or other yeast that gets in that can take the maltose will start producing alcohol, and then you wouldn't have a non-alcoholic beer anymore.
Right. So you got to be very, very careful with it. Is it? I mean, this probably isn't a yeast you can reuse generation to generation, at least at the brewer's level, right?
No, we recommend just repitching it. And the frozen liquid format was also our take on having a way of making a culture so pure that we feel confident that it can be used for non-alcoholic beer production. We didn't see good results with the dry format because when you dry it, you introduce too much contamination as we see it.
Uh-huh. So you have to pretty much work with liquid yeast.
Yes. And we have made, we now only have started with the Pica and the near strains here, but we're also starting to move into regular brewer's yeast. Those you cannot pitch as low as you do with the near strains and get good results. So there we basically sell them for propagation, meaning the big brewers that normally would prop up the yeast from slant, instead of doing that, they can, they don't need a lab. They don't have, the risk that whenever the slant has been grown up, the wort from the brewer is not ready, or vice versa. So they can just take it out of the freezer, defrost it an hour, and pitch the propagating tank directly.
So I assume this frozen format is the primary format you're using to distribute it then, right?
Yes, it's how we've been doing it, and I know it's quite different from what is out there, but I think it's also one of the nice thing about, especially for the non-alcoholic, as I said, for the purity.
Scott, what's been your experience working with the frozen liquid yeast format?
I think in terms of how we utilize it here, it's just making sure we're ready to, because we don't have a freezer that can get that cold. I have a brew day planned for the day that the yeast arrives, and so that's kind of how we've been working with it. But it's worked great. I mean, sometimes if in this case that a beer that I just did last week with it. We did have a brew day that was moved, and so I, instead of trying to freeze the yeast, I just put it in a sterile starter and just kind of kept it happy for a few days, and then pitched it. But I think that's really it's a timing thing with this yeast.
Well, Simon, I wanted to ask you about, a lot of companies are working with thiol boosting yeast now, and I guess we don't know if this is a particularly thiol boosting yeast, but you have mentioned it does generate some nice fruity esters out of it. What are some of the unique characteristics of this that tie into perhaps some of the trends in fruity IPAs and so on?
Yes, I guess Scott could talk much more about fruity IPAs, but for sure, this whole thing about thiolized and having to release thiol is one of the super hot topics right now, and something we are of course investigating, and also one of the reasons why we're working with Scott on this, to see what can we actually get out of this yeast. And as Scott also mentioned earlier, it's associated with the very fruity Sauvignon Blanc wines of New Zealand, where you have this thiol release. So that's one of our hopes, that we'll see a similar effect in beer, to release some of these the similar thiols with the hops. I was just looking through literature before we started this, and it's especially this yeast is known to make this 3-MHA, which is the acetate ester of the mercaptohexanol. And it seems to go very well in line with its ability to make isomyl acetate. That's one of the dominating esters, is of course an acetate esters, which will go hand in hand with making, for example, mercaptohexyl acetate ester.
So Scott, in addition to using these yeasts, I think you've been playing around a little bit with oxygen dosing, and I think you're doing oxygen dosing up front rather than continuous. But can you tell us about oxygen dosing and the role it plays in the process here?
Sure. So in our case, what's nice about this strain is you basically treat it like a normal brew day. So we're just oxygenating just like you typically would during knockout, and then that's all the oxygen we're dosing to these beers. And I think the key is if you're going to keep hitting it with oxygen, like Simon was talking earlier, then the yeast will just keep propagating, and they're not going to actually create any alcohol. But in our case, we're not adding any more oxygen, and so that's why we are getting the ferment that's actually taking place, which is getting us to like a 0.5% alcohol. So there's really kind of two approaches to that, and I'm sure Simon could probably talk more about the specifics.
Yeah, so I mean, you're basically doing an oxygen dose at the beginning, much like you would with a traditional brew, right? But Simon was talking about a specific characteristic where they literally hit it with oxygen the whole time, right, during the entire process. Yeah, correct?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Exactly.
So Simon, can you walk us through the continuous dosing and what's actually going on there? I mean, because we're not creating, the yeast is propagating, but it's not fermenting. I mean, exactly what's going on there?
Yeah, so what we see is that when we start, of course, we have all the wordy characters in the beginning, and we slowly start up using the oxygen that was added during knockout. And then when we hit about 1 to 2 ppm, we start giving it small pulses to go up to 2.5 ppm of oxygen. And we just keep going with this on-off regulation until we think the aroma is right. And in terms of aroma profile, we don't see a big change from the anaerobic process, but rather the same phases, 3 phases happening faster. And when I say phases, we see that we have first a phase where the wordy flavors, the aldehydes, get reduced. Then there's a little bit of a neutral phase in the middle where there's not a lot of aroma. And then from there on, it's just become more and more aromatic until the point where it's sometimes actually too aromatic, and we have had to sometimes dilute it a bit afterwards as well.
Interesting. I mean, what's going on with the yeast itself? Is it going through? It's going through the growth phase because it's propagating, right? But it's not. Yeah. It's never actually consuming the. It's not maltose, I guess, glucose that's left, right?
Yeah, so it's consuming the glucose and building biomass. So it's basically growing in there. So it's very similar to propagating. And because the yeast is scratch-free negative, you don't get any side product of alcohol. And we have actually been able to go very, very low. We did a trial where we linked it together with a dedicated mixing system called Isomix from Alfa Laval. And that really helps distribute the oxygen and dissolve it into the liquid. so there we got, I think, was 4 times 10 to the minus 4% alcohol. So about almost a factor 100 below the 0.05 limit.
That's amazing. And so I guess the yeast propagates, but it eventually drops out, but it never really produces ethanol as a byproduct then.
No, exactly. And what we do is then we just cool the process, and then to stop, because as soon as the oxygen depletes, it will, of course, even at very low temperature, produce alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
But what we do is we cool it to just above freezing point. And the reason we don't freeze it, and it seems very obvious, but of course there's no alcohol, so if you go below 0 Celsius, the tank will freeze. But we always like to tell brewers that, because sometimes these brewers are just set up so everything just a flick of a switch, and then they have a frozen tank.
Cold crash, yeah.
Of course, like to avoid that. But we cool it to 1 degree Celsius, so everything goes slow. Then we shut off the oxygen control, let the oxygen go to 0, so we don't have any residual oxygen, and then we separate it through a centrifuge. This yeast does not really flocculate, so if it were to sediment, it will take a very long time. And in that meantime, it will produce alcohol. So we don't have time to that. So we just, run it through a centrifuge to the bright tank, and then start carbonating. And the CO2, of course, at a certain level, also starting to inhibit the yeast, and only having very few cells left, then of course stabilizes the product enough so it can be kept in the bright tank and bottled from there.
Interesting. And I see you're pasteurizing it as well, probably, right?
Yes, and then of course pasteurizing afterwards. And as I said earlier, bottle/tunnel pasteurization is of course the preferred, because then everything is in a closed container. You don't risk any contamination.
Right. Well, Simon, can you walk us through some of the savings when you're producing this NA or AFB beer? You mentioned there's some good savings there.
Yeah, so one of the things we of course been comparing this process to is dealcoholization, and that's because we have seen that a lot of brewers starting to look into dealcoholization as the way of making 0.05% alcohol beer. 0.5 has been done several ways with cold contact and so on, but really until now the 0.05 or the alcohol-free has been dominated by dealcoholization equipment.
Right. So you're talking about you're talking about stuff that like boils off the alcohol, that kind of a thing, right?
Exactly, and it seems like almost a no-brainer, of course, that if you spend energy and money and the ingredients producing alcohol, and then spend more energy and resources to take the alcohol away, that would be less sustainable and require more malt. And we did some calculation to compare these two methods, and that the primary saving is of course on the malt. So instead of brewing maybe an 11 or 12 Plato starting gravity, we can brew it at 5 or 6, meaning we save about 50% of the malt, which equates to a huge savings, both on energy, but also, of course, on money for buying the malt.
Well, and I think the process that they use to dealcohol is quite expensive too, right? From an energy perspective, you got to essentially boil the wort at under a vacuum to get it to work, right?
Yes, that's the typical way it's done, what's called vacuum rectification.
Right. And that's quite expensive too, especially in an era of high energy prices.
Exactly, and as we also talked about, that's of course the OPEX for running it, but also getting this kind of equipment is not cheap. Whereas Scott has been able, for example, to run very easily with minimum capex investments to start actually making some non-alcoholic beer.
Mm-hmm. Scott, you mentioned there's some challenges in actually dry hopping these beers. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, I think one of the things to consider is that, alcohol itself is a extractant. And so, if you have like a double IPA, I think you might get a little better hop extraction than like a pale ale or a session beer. And I think this is the extreme case where you're now looking at something that's 0.5%. So for us, if I'm dry hopping these beers, I tend to like to use hop varieties that are very pronounced. So for example, last week I dry hopped one with Rawaka, just extremely intense
aroma
coming from a hop like that, or something like Nelson would be another one where it really comes through, and the yeast does a good job of hiding some of those wort-like flavors, but I think using a hop variety that's very expressive can even take it more into what you would typically find in in IPA. So you're trying your best to mimic that with the lower alcohol. Other things you could consider too. There's a lot of hop products on the market now that are oils. And
use oil extract, I assume.
Yep, exactly. And these you can add, to taste. You can do little test, lab samples and just kind of scale up or add it while you're kegging. You can just kind of put it into a keg that's purged and then go right on top of that just for a little bit more, some of that hop flavor that gets in there. The other thing too is to consider, like if you were, like in our case, we'll just steal wort from a batch that we're already brewing. So It's like if we're doing 15 gallons, it's typically like 5 gallons of the wort goes in and then like 10 gallons of water basically waters it down to get you to that Plato level.
The low gravity, yeah.
Yep. And so you're essentially watering down your bitterness too at that point. So I think, when you're dry hopping, you add a bittering acids called humulones. And I think, the dry hopping these beers at that point helps to boost that bitterness perception, bringing it back up to a level that you would anticipate from a hoppy beer. So, overall, I think there's less in the beer too. So in some ways, those hops don't have to do as much to shine through. But I think just the nature of these, I think using really expressive varieties or hop products are probably the way to at least experiment with first.
So, I mean, in addition to the dry hoppy, are you also concerned about adding bitterness back in then too? I mean, are you using hop extracts to do that or not?
Well, I think, you do get a little bitterness from dry hopping itself. And so that does help. You could, use some sort of like isomerized alpha acid extract that you could add to the beer at kegging to try to build in some more of that bitterness. But for what we've done so far, just kind of rely on, the bittering acids that you get introduced into the beer via dry hopping.
Right.
And then another thing to mention is sometimes the pH drop, you might be in the high 4s. And so if you're going to be dry hopping on top of that, that'll also raise your pH. And so you could consider, adding some form of acid to drop your pH into a range that's, a little less what I would consider like flabby if it's too high. And
yeah, I was kind of wondering about the overall pH balance for the beer, because obviously it's got a very high finishing pH compared to a normal beer, so it's probably not going to taste the same, right?
Yeah, and especially if you're dry hopping, then you can get, even closer to that 5 pH range. And so you could consider adding, some acid to get you down to, more typical 4 or 5, and just to make the beer a little snappier and more lively.
And what kind of acids are you using? I assume you're not using the wine tannic acid, the tannic acids that a lot of winemakers use. You're using something different, right?
Yeah, we typically use phosphoric acid here. That's, what we have on hand.
Yeah. Probably a small amount of lactic acid would be okay too, I would think, if it's, not overdone, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. Because it wouldn't take too much to get you, because you're not looking for a huge, pH drop, just enough to get you kind of into that normal, beer range, finished beer range.
Yeah. Yeah. Simon, you want to talk about finishing, packaging these beers? We already talked through some of the considerations. Obviously, the pasteurization is a kind of required if you're going to package it commercially. But you can talk us about some of the other considerations that come into play when you're trying to finish up these beers.
Yeah, so CO2 is one of them. Of course, it's the alcohol also really changes how the bubbles are formed. I saw a presentation of that. So we normally recommend carbonating a little bit higher than you would normally do to try to get the same carbonation feel.
Interesting. And then, does the carbonic acid help a little bit with the pH problem as well, perhaps?
Could, but in general, we use normally to recommend lactic acid to drop it.
Okay.
And the other aspect that Scott didn't touch upon with the lactic acid is normally you say you need to go below 4.5 for food safety reasons, for avoiding bacteria spoiling the beer. So for that, I would normally recommend to at least go below 4.5 in pH.
Right.
And that, as maybe a final comment for what Scott says on the hopping, we also have seen the brewers dry hopping and then not cooling quickly enough afterwards, and they introduce some kind of brewer's yeast while dry hopping. So normally, if you want to try to avoid that, as Scott said, extracts, but also increasing the whirlpool dosage can help.
So instead of doing dry hopping, use more of a whirlpool dosage where it's still hot and low risk of infection. Then, right?
It lowers the risk of infection and also helps with extraction because it's hot. So,
have you had problems with dry hopping contamination? I guess from dry hopping.
We had seen a single brewer, but that was because they had an infection with a lager yeast. They kept it not cold. They kept it at, I think it was 8 or 10 degrees Celsius, which is a perfect temperature for a lager yeast. So they saw an infection, and over the weekend, they went from less than 0.5 to 1.2 on one day.
Doesn't take much, I guess, huh?
No, it really doesn't, and that's why you have to be quite careful with these things.
Yeah. Any other packaging considerations or packaging tips?
No, I think really that's about it. Of course, you need to worry about residual oxygen in your final packaged beers, but that would be the same as for any other beer, right?
Yeah. So you're worried about oxygen. You're worried about yeast contamination. You mentioned you run the risk of contamination from. I guess you just have to keep things super clean, right?
Yes, really clean. And work diligently and make sure that things happen on time. You don't leave these too long. Especially
in a brewery where you're probably producing other beers, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Scott, how did your experiments turn out using the yeast? I know you've made at least a couple batches so far.
Yeah, so far they've been pretty fun. I really appreciate the fruity flavors you can get from just the small amount of fermentation that's going on. And just to touch on a little bit of what Simon was just saying on the, being sanitary side of things for these beers. I mean, we have a tankless hot water heater at the brewery, but I'm, completely running 180 water through the whole pump rig and flooding the fermenter with 180 water for about 25 minutes. So really pasteurizing everything that beer is going to touch to make sure there's no yeast. And in our case, even bacteria, since we have a lot of that floating around at our brewery.
Yeah, the brewer Sapwood Cellars, of course, specializes in creating beer from bugs, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so doing our best to make sure that everything that the NA beer is touching is completely sanitized. But what I think is fun about this is it's really just a normal brew day for if you're going to do this, at home if you're home brewing. And just like Simon said, it's just like treating it like a typical beer. Once it's done fermenting, you're purging your lines, you're purging the keg it's going into, doing your best to avoid any oxygen intake at that point. So it's really just it's a typical brew day in a lot of ways. The thing is recirculating during the fermentation, which is unique to these.
And the flavor of the finished beer?
Yeah, it's great. It's again, it's not like it's not going to taste exactly like an IPA or a double IPA because it's it's so the gravity is so low. But I think when you're pulling the right levers, you can get pretty close. If you're only at a 0.5% alcohol and you got good hop flavor in there, I think that's just for us it's a nice product just to have for people and for me it's just a challenge to try to make a beer that's hop forward that's still such a low gravity and I'm still playing with it. We'll continue to brew with it and try different techniques for dry hopping or different varieties and kind of see which flavors play well with the esters you're getting. And I think I would like to start doing some more experimentation with co-pitching Pichia with a sack strain. There's some, like Simon mentioned, they're in the wine world they have looked at this wild yeast and have seen a little bit of thiol release from it. It would be fun to do some beers and send to a lab to see if there's any thiol release happening in a co-pitch scenario. Well, maybe you give Pichia a day or 2 days head start and then pitch your normal sack strain after that.
Interesting.
And then I think and Simon can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it is a killer strain, and so I think you would probably pitch a little more sack than you typically would if you experiment with that. But those are the kind of things I'm excited to start playing around with.
Well, Simon, has this hit the home brewing market yet? Probably not yet, huh?
No, as I said, the pitches are the smallest we have is for 50 hectoliters. So no, we haven't really, and I think it's not the aim of Christian Hansen to go for the home brew market with this. And I would have to talk with my commercial colleagues.
No, I understand.
About this. So I wouldn't be able to say.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see. But how do you think this is going to impact, say, the craft brewing market?
I think we see that the craft brew market in Europe has already turned a lot to non-alcoholic, and in this sense, I think Europe is a little bit ahead of the US, but definitely the US is up and coming. So I think we'll see a lot happening with this in the next 2-3 years in the US, and of course, hope this can be part of showing that you don't need a big capex investment. You can actually go out quite easily and make some great beers. And maybe to comment on what Scott said on the flavor, for me, one of the great experiences when you serve a beer like this that is 0.5, and you ask people, guess the alcohol, and people goes, it's probably a session, so 3.5-4% alcohol.
Interesting.
Just getting to that level where you start tricking people just to think it's a session beer, I think then we're starting to get close to something where we actually start to resemble actual beer.
And Simon, your closing thoughts, having worked across several different breweries now with this new yeast strains, how's it been?
It's been great, and as I said earlier, I really enjoy working with brewers like Scott that likes to experiment and test the boundaries and really see it as an opportunity for creating some great beers and having a little bit of different flavor, because it does not have to be non-alcoholic. You can also use it as for flavor differentiation. And in general, I'm very passionate about brewing and developing new products. So for me to be able to help brewers with this it's been a great journey.
Interesting. Scott, your closing thoughts working with the new yeast strains, and I think this is one of your first times making an non-alcoholic beer, at least at a commercial level, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think we still have a lot to learn when it comes to using Pichia and trying to play with it more. It's all still, very experimental to us. But I think it's just, when you're, like you said, Simon mentioned, it's not really going to be a homebrew product necessarily, but maybe if you have a local brewery that is buying big pitches, maybe you could ask them for a little bit. But, for me, I think just thinking about ways to build in more complexity into these, since it's so low of, gravity, I think, considering using something like a beta lyase enzyme or during fermentation, something that can, help build, maybe release some more precursors from hop products from your whirlpool, anything that just kind of builds in more complexity, I think is worth considering when you're trying to make a big flavorful beer at only, 0.5%. So I think Aeromaze has a product that releases some precursors, and there's a handful of other ones out there, and they're typically all sold on wine websites for the most part. But that's what I just did with the Riwaka dry hop one that I'm going to be kegging later today. That one fermented with the beta lyase enzyme to release bound precursor styles from the hops that were in the whirlpool, and as well as now we know where also precursors on grain.
That's really cool. Very, very interesting. So you guys are all kind of on the cutting edge here of producing non-alcoholic beer. Very nice. Well, it's been great having you both on as guests. Scott, a pleasure having you on today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And Simon, thank you for keep shipping me the yeast so I can have something to play with.
And Simon, a great pleasure having you on as a first-time guest. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me, and great to work with you, Scott. I really appreciated the sparring we have had on these projects.
And today my guests were Scott Janish, author of the book The New IPA, and Simon Carlsen from CHR Hansen. Great having you both on, Scott. Pleasure.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
Simon, always a pleasure to have you as well. Thanks again.
Thank you.
A big thank you to Scott Janish and Simon Carlsen for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They offer access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and the amazing Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com to get your subscription today. I also want you to check out the web-based version of BeerSmith, which is now available at BeerSmithRecipes.com. BeerSmith for the web lets you build, edit, and brew recipes from any browser, including your desktop, your tablet, or your mobile device. You can try BeerSmith Web for 30 days by setting up an account at BeerSmithRecipes.com. If you purchase a Gold, Platinum, or Pro license, you get both BeerSmith Web and the desktop version of BeerSmith for one low price. Check out BeerSmithRecipes.com today to give it a try. I'd like to thank you for listening. I hope you have a great brewing week.